Hi, everyone. So we will be talking about a motion today. The motion is this House believes that schools should teach children to be skeptical of parental authority. Broadly, there are three thematic areas that become important in this debate. One, the role of schools. Two, what limitations do we put on parental authority, and is this a fair limitation? And of course, three, how will this policy play out on the ground, right? How does it affect the interactions between parents and children, or even parents and schools? So, in terms of the key terms in the motion, it is reasonable to define children as kids who are in middle school onward. So, these are like 10, 11-year-old kids, if not older. Um, and the term skeptical is going to be a really important term in the debate. And it is quite likely that there will be some contention between the teams about what this term means and what it looks like to teach kids to adopt this attitude. So, what's important is that both teams are reasonable about how they define skeptical, that they try to agree on a common definition. At the same time, they need to be willing to acknowledge the worst forms of skeptical of how skepticism can play out on either side. So they need to be willing to play ball with each other's worst case as well, because this is a bit of a slippery term, right? So on the proposition side, it is reasonable to say that, look, schools are a good place to do this because schools are subject to regulation. There is oversight, there are academic standards, so we know what's going on. By skeptical, we don't mean teaching kids to outright rebel against their parents, because that's not what the word means. It also doesn't mean rude or disrespectful. It doesn't even mean immediately disagreeing with everything your parents say. Skepticism is, in a way, a scientific attitude, right? It means not believing things at face value. It means being willing to fact check certain claims. Also consulting other sources instead of relying on just one source. It means being able to disagree with what you are being told. So it still requires children to listen and listen respectfully, but it just doesn't require them to immediately believe everything their parents tell them. And it is fair to contrast this proposal of Prop, this type of skepticism that Prop is advocating for, with more traditional models of parenting. And what do traditional models look like? It's also important for Prop to acknowledge that this is not monolithic and that there has been, change across generations. But very broadly, one of the most dominant popular models of parenting is still your authoritarian model, where children are expected to defer to their parents or be obedient and not openly question or doubt their parents, right? So the authoritarian model is still quite the dominant model, especially at the age you're talking about. So this can be the comparative that you discuss. There will be some quibbling over, what the comparative is, but both teams should be willing to some extent, debate around these characterizations. Now, on Prop, it is helpful to paint a picture of the world or the context that we live in, which is that somehow we seem to assume that there is this magical line when someone becomes a parent. It's almost like a magical moment where they then are conferred with wisdom and they're responsible for another life, and somehow there's an assumption that they know what they're doing, and that they suddenly have all the life experience necessary for them to draw on to be able to raise and guide this new life, right? And children tend to be seen as extensions of their parents, or sometimes even like property of their parents, right? So, and I think on Prop, you have a lot of rhetorical space to really grandstand here and say, look, we would be lying to ourselves if we assumed that every adult was scientifically literate or open or tolerant or nonviolent. As a matter of fact, we still live in a world where there are high rates of dangerous attitudes like homophobia, sexism, anti-science attitudes like high rates of vaccine hesitation, for example. And these are adults that hold these views, right? And these views don't disappear when they become parents. They are still the same homophobic, racist, sexist, anti-vax people. And even if they have more, and so that's your worst type of parent framing. Of course, there are the middle of the road parents as well that you don't want to forget about in this debate, right? And you can say, even for those parents, for anyone really, their life experience is quite limited. So even if they've had more years on earth than their kids, they might not have the same set of experiences. They might not have the same, gender and sexual identity. They might not have the same set of relationships or expectations that they have to face, right? So they can't really immediately know what's best for their kids. So there's a little bit of context building there. And I think there are two key arguments that need to come out on the prop side. One, that this is necessary to protect children and uphold their rights. And I think that is the more attack-based argument, your offensive material. And I think as early as the first speech, you probably need to do some defensive work and talk about how this actually normalizes open relationships between parents and children, because you know that your vulnerability is that the other side is going to talk about how this makes parents really defensive and paranoid, right? So let's talk about the first bit first, which I think is where you do want to spend most of your time on why it is necessary to do this to protect children and uphold their rights. And I think you can start with a concession here and say, we are willing to accept that most parents do want what is best for their kids in the way they think is best for their kids, right? So it's not a question of intention here for most parents, but intentions are not enough, right? What happens is sometimes parents simply lack the capacity, the cognitive skills, the life experience, the empathy, the maturity to actually indeed do what is best for their children or advise their children in a way that has their best interest. Well, it might have their best interest at heart, but that will lead to their best interest being realized. And so you can talk about how, and there are several layers to this argument. One, as it stands, parents already, even if we have some, restrictions on the power of parents over children, because we recognize that their power over kids should not be absolute, right? And we already intervene when abuse happens, but these are very reactive interventions. A lot of times the damage has already been done. We want to pretend that home is a site of like support and love, but sometimes it's also a site of violence or ambivalence. And parents already have a disproportionate influence over their child. Why? They have financial control over their child. They control their child's like access to housing. And even intimacy is a form of control to some extent, because your child loves you, your child feels indebted to you, your child trusts you and feels safe with you. And there are also like just more or less visible ways of shaping the mindset of their child in terms of habituation, in terms of like what norms you set in the household and all of these things. These forms of influence still don't go away. They still continue to exist, even as we tell children to be skeptical of their parents. We recognize that on prop, right? But why is this policy so important? It's important because children need to know that it is okay to doubt their parents and that they don't need to feel guilty or feel disloyal if they disagree, or if they choose to fact check their parents, or if they choose to consult other sources, for example. And this is especially valuable for children who don't conform to normative ideals of what a good child is, for example. So LGBT children, for example, who are disproportionately traumatized by their childhood experiences because of parental punishment, parental bullying, and parental corrective measures like sending them to conversion therapy or like forcing them to behave in heteronormative ways. Or like ultra religious homes, right, with very gendered ways of raising children, or like telling, for example, girls that they can only dress a certain way and certain forms of behavior are unacceptable, or parents who are anti-vaccination or anti-medical medical treatment, for example. So in these situations, kids, one of the biggest barriers is kids feeling guilty and feeling like the problem is with them. And that they are disloyal. So if it is normalized that it is actually okay to challenge your parents because they're not an absolute authority, that is valuable to these children. Some of them will be able to act. I mean, the ability of children to act on this will vary depending on the resources available to them, right? Some of the children will not necessarily be able to act on it immediately, in that they can't really divorce their parents then and there or leave the home. But A, the mental freedom is still very important to them, but also B, it makes them more likely to, in a material sense, seek support, seek counseling, or even report these things, or plan their lives in such a way that it increases the possibility of emancipation from their parents sooner. So planning more independent paths or futures. And many kids are denied this because they continue to think that they are bad children for defying parental authority. Now, there are several scenarios in which this can play out, and I think it's important to be preemptive on prop, right? If the relationship with their parents was good anyway, this does not harm it, right? As a matter of fact, this strengthens that relationship because it increases the openness and the conversation between parents and children. Now, if the relationship was bad, or if the parents tended to like impose their way of doing things or seeing the world on their kids, and were very intolerant, then even without this policy, there would be tension. But what this policy does is it gives children a psychological safety net of knowing that it's okay, right? So you want to win on all those fronts. And on families that have a more neutral relationship, then you can also like characterize how this doesn't make things worse. And here are some of the benefits of it. The second is a more defensive argument, but it's important to have it in place because this is going to be one of the key attacks of the other side, which is that you normalize more open relationships between parents and children. And you can say, look, family relationships are not static. They evolve over time, right? And parents now, if this becomes the norm, they know to expect it. And they will now be more prepared to be challenged, right? So it will feel less like an ambush, less like an attack. It will make them, like, if they are prepared for it, and if they're aware that every child does this to their parents, and that this is the expectation, then it's going to feel less like a threat and more like a common feature of parenting, which means parents themselves will also adjust for this and be more willing to answer more questions or be less, heavy-handed or draconian with their views. Now, on the opposition, I think it is important to accept in theory the proposition side's definition of skepticism because it is quite a reasonable definition. But it is also fair for opposition to say, look, even if this is what you intend in theory, and this is the message you're going to send to children, that's not always how the message is going to be received. Even if you tell them, don't be rude, don't immediately disagree, you must fact check with credible sources, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to play out in the way you intended as well. And here you can characterize then kids as already predisposed to, asserting their autonomy at a young age and to being quite short-sighted. And let's talk more about that in a bit. But basically, the other thing you can say here is this policy also assumes the best of schools, right? But schools are not uniform. In fact, there's wide variance in terms of standards. And if you are in a conservative part of the world, it is very likely actually that the school ends up undermining something that a progressive parent teaches their kids. So there's always that risk, and that's something you can blow up later on. Okay, what do you stand for then on OP? Because this is also important. Sorry, I am running out of my voice. Okay. I think on OP, it's still important to say, look, you still defend teaching kids safe reporting avenues in case they're being abused. You still defend teaching them how to identify and report abusive behaviors, how to access support services if they're LGBT kids. When they hit a certain age, I think 13 or 14, you still support them being able to access emergency contraception or speak to doctors without their parents necessarily being notified of reproductive health issues. So you still support all of these things, but you do not want to frame them as an open confrontation against the parents. You don't want to create that fault line because that's unnecessary. And obviously, the amount of freedom kids have, it happens on a sliding scale anyway. The older they get, the more physical and intellectual freedom they have just by virtue of how their courses are designed, how their brains develop. So there's really no need for this policy. And I think you discussed two things on OP, which really are the flip of the two things that Prop discussed, which is a nice, clean debate, right? One, that it's harmful to children, and two, that it makes parents worse. So why would it be harmful to children? And I think here you challenge directly Prop's assertion that most parents are unqualified or most parents don't actually know what is in the best interest of their children. I think you say, look, on balance, most parents are sensible. They're not, trying to turn their children into carbon copies of themselves. Like everyone's just trying to get by. Parents are just trying to keep their kids alive. They outsource a lot of these decisions to schools already. A lot of their authorities already, clipped anyway, because schools take over most of children's time during the day. Parents and kids don't actually spend that much time together anymore, et cetera, et cetera. And as kids get older, as I said, they get significantly more space to be free physically and intellectually. The danger of inserting a policy of this sort in their younger years, so in their puberty years or early teenage years, is that kids tend to be quite short-sighted, partly because of a genuinely lack of cognitive development, but also lack of life experiences to understand consequences of their actions. Plus, crazy hormones are something we shouldn't be discounting, right? Also, kids at this age are vulnerable to manipulation too, by their peer group, or by other adults, or by the internet. And when you provide them, essentially telling them to be skeptical, when you tell a child to be skeptical, what the child hears is they have a license to disagree with their parents. It becomes really dangerous because it's easy to find basis for any self-serving disagreement. We're assuming that kids are going to be judicious and smart about how they disagree, right? But if a kid goes, well, I want to use drugs, I want to smoke, I want to drive drunk, I want to party all night, I don't like math, at any point, any of these arguments will be justified in some online forum or by some crazy peer that they might be interacting with. It's not difficult to come up with justifications for any form of disagreement. And kids do not have the life experience to adjudicate whether these are sensible arguments in the first place, but we've kind of just provided them a license and told them that they too are counter authorities to their parents, which means it becomes easier for kids to act on these things and behave in very reckless ways. And so we encourage open confrontation between kids and their parents. We encourage reckless behavior. And we are also being unfair to parents fundamentally because we have so many expectations from parents to raise their kids properly and, pay for their kids. But at the same time, we are taking away all the authority they have over children. If children end up making a bad decision because they defied their parents, and who's going to take responsibility for that, right? The law would hold the parents responsible, which is quite unfair. Second, it also makes parents worse. Why? Parents now see schools and teachers as a threat. They see their kids' peers as a threat, even more so than they already do now. They become defensive, they become afraid of being defied, and they are more likely to double down and be more proactively indoctrinate kids. And this affects certain kids disproportionately, because if the parents are as conservative as characterized by Prop, right, they're likely to be stricter. They are likely to double down on women kids or LGBT kids. So the same kids that you were trying to help are kids you will end up actually harming by making their parents paranoid and overly defensive. So there are ways to open up spaces for dialogue in the family, to encourage more or less authoritarian family models, but it does not have to be through this extreme overcorrection of teaching kids to not trust their parents. So I think that's what you say on the opposition side. Anyway, I hope this was useful, and good luck for the rest of the debate activities.